Ah, good afternoon. This is going to be part 2 of the video installments of this series of videos I've decided I'd start making about this 1942 Lincoln Continental. It's kind of a barn find I came across last October and assessed it pretty good, got some issues resolved with it, but now I'm working on its actual, probably the real core problems with this car, and that has to do with the clutch. And I probably mentioned in a previous video, there's the transmission still hooked to my engine hoist. But if you watch my last video, I described using the clutch in this car was not clutch chatter. It was whiplash, shakes the entire car, and the only way you could get it out of on level grade to even get it going was to sort of kind of gently ride the clutch, get it to kind of kick itself going, and then just let off the pedal, just dump the pedal. And that doesn't work very well for day in and out driving, and nor is that good for the car. But you can see now that I have everything out, how much room there is in here. There's a lot of stuff that's now been pulled out. I've actually pulled the rear axle back. You can see if you look under the back of the car here. Now sitting down on a pair of dollies. And those come in really handy for doing this kind of work. Although I do know I'm going to actually have to slide it all the way out, and I'm pulling the rear axle out from under the car to do some repairs on it, which I'll go give you a little bit of an overview of that in a second. But just wanted you to see down in here. And now that we have the transmission removed and you can actually see this, just remember, I'll come back up here for a second. This was one of the very few that actually had the Liquimatic transmission. Ford's first kind of disastrous, really, effort, because they bought them all back. And they converted all of them to manual transmissions. And I only found one picture of a Liquimatic, and that's at the early V8 Ford Museum, attached to the back of a 42 Mercury V8, which is the only other car in the Ford line that used Liquimatic. But you can see the top of the bell housing. This looks pretty much, from this view, this probably looks very familiar to your flathead Ford V8 guys, hot rodders. You guys out there have probably seen this view a few times too. But this is a V12. It's similar to the V8 Ford. Of course, most people that are really into these cars kind of know there's quite a few, there's a few interchangeable parts. Not too many, but more than I realized. And it's actually made working with this car quite nice and easy. And most parts are, believe it or not, even available. There's actually a lot of parts available at Summit Racing. I'm giving them a plug. But because they're local to me and they're a local business. Right now I'm trying to support just local businesses, so. But anyway, you can see that bolt pattern. You've got the 4 bolts at the top that hold the top of the bell housing on. But you need to look at the four or 5 around the bottom. And you notice that that pattern is much larger in diameter, and you can see they hang way, way out. And that is because the oil pan for a Liquimatic V8 or Liquimatic transmission is different than a conventional manual transmission oil pan. And I'm just going to fabricate some support brackets that I'm going to find me just the right size tap. I'm going to gently tap the holes on the bell housing. They'll wrap over the top of the bell housing and then have a spacer on them to make contact, and then thread and then bolt into that oil pan. At least 2 or 3, however, 2 to 3 around the bottom, just to help stabilize this, so it's not putting an undue amount of strain, you know, bending on that bell housing with the torque loading when you take off from a stop. Because that does flex. Most people don't realize how much that does actually flex, but it flexes enough that over time, that if it's, especially in the case of this car with a bad clutch shaking everything, it's surprising me that it didn't actually crack the bell housing or break it. I've actually seen that happen before in other cars. I've never necessarily seen it in one of these, but I have seen this happen in other vehicles, even front-wheel drive cars, where they have sort of a thin bell housing, because it's not very thick. There's not a lot of meat there really around this. This isn't like some of these, you know, ones from the 60s with the big blocks and the muscle cars. Those were considerably heavier. Of course, those are much more horsepower than the little Zephyr V12 puts out. But anyhow, so I should show you those items that I've got out, and I'm going to show you the culprit of the main culprit of the problems with this car are two things that are wrong: this clutch and the universal joint, which I'll show you in a moment. And you can see here we have the clutch disc, and this is the side facing us, is the side that faces the flywheel, and it was installed correctly, because there's no way you can put this one in backwards. There's just no way. You'd never get the pressure plate on. The back side of this sticks out entirely too far that way. But on the disc you can see where it's got a lot of spots where it's just hitting, and it's like it's been having something skipping on it. And the disc itself looks pretty good, but I'm going to replace this anyway, just due to the nature of the fact that with the pressure plate being the real problem, it's actually taken chunks out of this, so this surface isn't as flat as it should be, and that would contribute to chatter as well. And it's not worn out by any means. It still has some life left in it, but it's definitely got some minor issues. But the biggest issue is this pressure plate, and when I turn it over you'll see why. And the first thing you're going to notice, and I'll turn it this way so this is just easier for me to see on camera, you see these contact points, these hot spots. This is kind of this indicates to me that clutch is not disengaging evenly or engaging evenly, or even better yet, it is not the springs that actually hold all the pressure against the disc and the flywheel are not evenly loaded. And I could see this even with the clutch installed, that the three arms as I rolled it around were not even. And even though that with the pressure plate unloaded, the three adjusters actually look like they are pretty flat and plain, and they are all making contact with the pressure plate housing. It's when I look inside at the springs, and inside it's kind of hard to see this, and it's almost impossible to see this on camera. You actually have to almost see it in person. But as I roll this around, I can see that some of the springs are compressed. They're not. It's obvious that there's a problem with the tension on a few of these, and that is what causes a clutch to chatter. And over time it gets progressively worse as the springs weaken. So it's got weak springs. I figured they might even be broken, but they're not broken, they're just weak. And anyhow, rather than correct the problem, whoever worked on this to try to fix the clutch chatter did the other trick, and I have done this myself, and I've had a 69 Ford Econoline van up until last year, until right before I got this car, that had exactly this same style clutch, just a little bit bigger. It was an 11-inch, this is a 10-inch. A little bit different disc, but basically otherwise the pressure plate is the same design and nearly identical. And it had the same problem. And you tighten up the adjustment on the pedal to make the pedal push the throwout bearing against these arms and ride on the arms, and that pushes the pressure plate further back when the pedal is down, away from the disc, because as this pressure plate is spinning around in the engine, if you was to see it watch it, if you could see through the bell housing while it was running, as you unloaded the pressure plate, you'd actually see it going back and forth like this, because the springs are not evenly loaded on these arms, and it's actually causing the pressure plate to release at an angle in relation to the disc and the flywheel. So it's not staying square, and that will cause this to make contact with the clutch disc, kicking it around and spinning the disc. And being this is a non-synchro car, it won't be able to shift into first gear. And if you keep tightening up the clutch too far, it'll actually start slipping. But you'll at least be able to get it into first gear. but it'll still chatter, rattle, and in the case of this, it had failed so badly that it was whiplash and shake. But anyhow, I'm going to give you the next part of the problem, which is the U-joint. It's actually over here. Inside that torque tube, of course, every Ford guy that's got early V8 Ford cars up through 48 knows about the torque tube and the universal joints. These are a fun thing to change because you got to take the rear end out, and this one is just toast. You could actually hear this thing rattling inside the tube, and you could actually feel it take up slack and take up tension, and it would actually shudder. You could feel a shudder going to the rear end. And I thought I was hoping, and I was, upon further inspection so far, from what I can tell, it's definitely not a problem with the ring and pinion gear. It was just the U-joint was just that bad. So it was about ready to let loose. And it was this dry. When I pulled it out of the, when I opened the ball coupler up, this is how dry it was. Normally these things are packed in grease. This one had been run dry. So when I go to put it all back together, of course it's going to get new seals put on the torque tube, ball coupler, and all of that. Around the transmission, the seals that go around the back. You can buy all of these parts. They're all, well, relatively readily available from a couple of suppliers. Most of the parts prices, unless you get into some of the engine work, can get expensive, but some of these parts are relatively pretty reasonable. But then I'm going to show you the next problem we will be working on once the transmission's in, and that is the rear axle. And I need to get a flashlight for this because this part is definitely it's over on the other side. Apologize for bad camera work here, doing this with a phone camera, but there we go. The next problem, let me shine some light underneath the car here. Now you can see I have the rear axle down. I have popped the spring off, and I left the spring attached to the U-bolts there. I had it still attached to the car when I took this loose. That was to avoid having it fight with it on the ground or have it come up and bite me. And I've had that happen before too. Although these have a lot more preload tension than a Model T Ford. So I had in the process of that, it actually exposed another problem that I would have never seen had it not ripped this crossmember loose from the frame. And the spring is held in. The spring, which holds the whole back end of the suspension basically in the car, it's everything but the shocks and the parking brake cables. This holds pretty much everything in the back of the car. And all that holds the crossmember in the back of the car is this vulcanized rubber mount. And this is kind of a common issue with Ford cars and vulcanized rubber mounts without safety bolts run through them. And this is one of those places they really should have put safety bolts all the way through. Instead, that bolts are riveted to the mount, and the crossmember just is bolted to that. And the only thing that holds the crossmember in is just vulcanized rubber. And in my own personal experience with having drag cars, especially Fords, the factory motor mounts never held up very good because of this. And they had a tendency to just rip right apart. The same 69 Ford van I referenced earlier about the clutch disc, I put no less than 5 engine mounts and 3 transmission mounts in it in 28 years that I owned it. And it was the same exact problem, and it's actually, this problem plagues cars, even the Tauruses and Tempos, Escorts, all of them had just cheap vulcanized rubber mounts without any kind of safety strap, limit strap, or safety bolt on them. And they would fail and fall apart. And that's exactly what's happened here. The nice thing is here, the rubber on the sides is pretty good. It's not too hard. I could probably send this out and have it revulcanized, but I'm going to elect to not do that. I'm not actually going to disturb this for fear of losing my axle alignment. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put new rubber on the top of this, up here on the top of this, and repad the top, because that's pretty badly gone. And then I'm going to drill through the bottom of the, oops, sorry with the light, but I'm going to drill through the bottom of the crossmember. I'm going to install 2 safety bolts there, and then I'm going to put 1 through the side, probably just for sanity purposes. 3 to 4 in each side, and they'll go all the way through the frame. And you can see that the frame is exposed on the top. Even though this is a unibody car, it does have kind of like a frame underneath of it that would be almost like a separate body frame, but it's not. It is a unitized car. But there, at least it's open on top of that rail, so I actually have access to put bolts and nuts and don't have to do anything crazy there. But that's an insulator mount, and I still want to rubber insulate it. It just will have safety bolts there to prevent that from moving side to side. It can't move front to back, but it can move side to side, and it can move up and down. And I'm going to eliminate that by installing safety bolts. And any of you Lincoln Zephyr and Lincoln Continental owner guys out there that have never seen this happen, this might be something you may want to be aware of if you ever are working around the rear axle of your car, to inspect this area. Because if you jack up the car and this mount fails, believe it or not, it can just pull the spring, and the crossmember will just pull right out of the frame. And it is not safe to drive around with that thing just sliding side to side, because you could actually, your wheels could hit your fenders, could tear a brake line, you never know, because the only thing holding it beyond this that's got any kind of strength is the ball socket at the far end of the torque tube, and that really isn't a lot of metal up there. So we're going to fix that. And while I have this far apart, I'm also going to pull the axle tubes off, the drums. It's going to get all new brakes, brake hardware put inside in here. All new seals. This stuff in here is, I can tell just by looking at it, it's never been apart. So this car has about 67,000 miles on it, and it's probably never been apart from new. Wouldn't be surprised if it's ever been touched. And the one thing I noticed, it does have grease plugs for the outer bearings, and I'm going to pull those plugs out. And those grease plugs, if you don't know where they are on the bottom side of the axle tube, on the back side here. They're down, it's kind of hard to see, I have too much stuff in the way, but they're down, I think they're on the back side. No, they're on the front side. They're down towards the bottom, but they're near where the axle tube meets the back of the backing plate. And you can put Zerk fittings in there, and then every once in a while, don't get overzealous with the grease, because you can actually overcome the seal and end up greasing your brakes, and that would not be a good thing. But a couple of pumps once in a while won't hurt anything, and that'll keep those roller bearings from failing. And I can tell you, if you've ever had an outer axle bearing fail, it's not a pleasant experience when the car comes squealing to a halt, or worse yet, it snaps the shaft, the wheel comes off and sets the car on the ground, or even worse yet, have an accident. I've actually had axle shafts walk out of rear ends on me before, and that's not a pleasant experience, and I'd rather not relive it here. So that'll come out once I get the transmission back in. I'll get it all hooked back up. Then I'm going to pull this all out from under the car, disassemble it, clean and inspect, repair as necessary, reseal it, put any new bearings in it that are needed, install all new brakes, hydraulics, hardware, shoes, etc. I do have a drum lathe, so I'm going to turn my drums while I have them off, give them just a quick glance on the drum lathe, just to kind of true them up. I don't want to take too much off of them. They're probably not in too bad a shape. I'll find out once I get them off. But anyhow, with that, I'm going to sign off this video installment. But hopefully everybody's out there safe, because I've been home and safe, and I've been obviously working on this car, getting things done. And I figured at least this way through YouTube, I can at least share my cars, where normally I would be out at a car show doing so. But anyway, again, everyone be safe and have a beautiful, blessed day. Thank you.